So here's the outline of how things are going to proceed this morning. We'll start with the discussion of the 707 3rd Street property across the street to the south, and then move on to the details of the Camp Emmaus property. I'll be talking about some of the history, some of the discussions that went on between us and Pathways in getting to this point, the initial offer that we had from Pathways. I'll try to summarize where we're at, and then we'll move on to motions. Well, first we'll have a motion over the 707 3rd Street South property with discussion, vote, and we're going to do everything by ballot today, by paper ballot. So I appreciate the tellers and their willingness to help us out. And then we'll move on to motion number 2, which will be the Emmaus property. And I'll have both motions up here on the screen for you to see. So just again, if you were at the informational session last week, nothing has changed from what I'm presenting. This is the property to the south. You can all see Gate City Bank right here. And the property that we have then is outlined in the yellow. So this is, of course, our storage garage down here. It's all of the driveway leading up to the storage garage with a little bit of width to the east and the west, particularly to the west. Gate City would like to use this for expanded parking, and they've wanted this for a long time. We will be able to use that parking on Wednesday evenings, on weekends, as we would need. And they've offered us $100,000 for this, plus they will take on all incurred expenses. Okay? So I guess right now, before we move on, are there any questions about this particular property? Pastor Matt is our roaming microphone holder. There'll be opportunities at the end again, but we do have a question in the back. And everybody, just make sure to state your name before you give your comments so everybody knows who's speaking.
Morning, Mark. Keith Bode here. I know they use it for storage for like the stage and things like that, probably with what's coming. I presume that'll be stored on camp or on property. Is that where that's most likely going to be stored?
Yeah. Right now, it's going to whatever is stored in there currently is going to move over into our property around the Lost and Found that's not being used. Is that related to the thrift shop, I guess, Pastor Simon? It's related to the thrift shop? The garage and the shop area. So that's taken care of. Other questions about this? And again, at the end, we'll formally present this as a motion. There'll be another opportunity for discussion and questions at that time as well. So let's move on now to the Emmaus property. And as so many of you know, this history runs very rich and this history runs very deep. So we do not enter into an agreement like this lightly, but I do appreciate that we have come to this point. So let me give everybody who maybe doesn't know the history a little bit of a primer. So Trinity's involvement with this property goes back to 1933 when the pastors of both Trinity and Bethlehem Lutheran in Ulen purchased these 80 acres near Monaga to establish this Bible camp. And a little bit of internet searching did come up with a nice picture of our senior pastor back then, Fred Schutz, who was the senior pastor from 1932 to 1938. And you can see then did move on from Trinity, was actually president of the American Lutheran Church, and then later president of the Lutheran World Federation as well. But again, this property was purchased for the purpose of establishing a Bible camp for the churches of Northwest Minnesota to use. The first campers arrived that next year in 1934. That was a Trinity confirmation class. And then in 1955, Bethlehem sold its interest to Trinity. You can see here for $14,000. So Trinity has been the sole owner of this property then since 1955. In 1968, an additional 200 acres was purchased. But then in 1969 is when the Pathways Corporation was formed, and since that time, Pathways has taken over the operation and the maintenance of the camp. So fast forward, from the documents that we found, from 1978 to 1985, there was a series of one-year leases between $10,000 and $13,000 per year that Emmaus was paying to Trinity for use of that land to run the Bible camp. I think there was some dissatisfaction. Some of you may have been involved with those discussions back then, but there was some dissatisfaction that Pathways was paying all this money to Trinity when it could be investing that money in the camp instead. So an agreement was reached that if Pathways could raise $250,000 to build this new dining hall over here, then there would be a 25-year lease agreement through which Pathways would pay Trinity $1 per year and then would invest $10,000 per year in the camp improvements. And this is still the operation that we've been working with really since that time. You'll notice in 1986 that another 67 acres was purchased. This is actually adjacent to the Emmaus property itself, and I'll show you a map here in a little bit. So now the total is 347 acres, again, growing from that initial 80 acres that Pastor Schutz was involved with back in 1933. I will say also that Pathways has done one other $250,000 campaign since this time. I believe it was in the very late 90s, and that was to actually turn the bottom of this dining hall into an adult retreat center. Here are the properties that we're referring to. This will look familiar to many of you. Camp Emmaus itself is in this area that I'm circling with the pointer right down here, which of course is right adjacent to Lake Morgan. And this is the original 80 acres from 1933. For those of you who've been there, this is the road we come in on, this is the road that we go into the camp, and then we make that little circle around the dining hall, and then the chapel is right up next to the lake. Then we have the other properties that were purchased in 1968, these 40 acres to the north of Stocking Lake, and then the 160 acres that's mostly undeveloped out here to the northeast. And then, of course, in 1986 is when the Eder property was purchased. So now just keep in mind we have parcel 1, parcel 2, parcel 3, and parcel 4. Just a little more about how Trinity has supported Pathways over the last, at least this shows over the last decade. Going back, I had Jan pull up some numbers for us, and this is what we've given to Pathways out of our mission plan and out of our benevolences every year for the last 11 years, total of $152,000, ranging everywhere from, you can see, 11.6 to 15. And then also our foundation has been generous to Pathways as well, giving $30,000. And then, of course, we've been giving Pathways free use of office space since 2008, first in the yellow building and now actually here in this facility itself. And then not to mention all the campers that we've sent there over these years. So how did these discussions arise? A little over a year ago now, Pastor Simon was contacted by someone who has neighboring property to Emmaus, who was interested in purchasing all 4 parcels and then eventually, probably after 5 years, donating Camp Emmaus, parcel number 1, back to Pathways. So we thought this was an interesting idea. There had certainly been, if you go back and look at the history of our relationship with Pathways, it seems like once every decade, the council gets involved in some kind of a discussion about figuring out a new agreement, a new relationship between Trinity and Pathways, and then it never gets any traction, and we just go back to the status quo again. But we thought this was a really interesting offer that would allow Pathways to continue operating as a Bible camp. So we were interested in where this might go. So in April, a year ago, we contacted a Park Rapids realtor, Jack Brand, and asked him what might this property be worth. And then as these discussions started to move on, I got in touch with Pastor Chris Leach from Our Saviors in Barnesville, who is the Pathways board chair, to let him know that we were having these discussions and to start engaging him and the Pathways leadership in what this might look like. So this ultimately took us to June of last year when we asked Jack to solicit formal offers on the Trinity property to be received by July 31st. So these offers came in, and I'm summarizing. There were permutations of some of these offers, but I'm showing the main 3 right now. So you see that Pathways said they would like to purchase all 4 properties, 1 to 4, for $500,000. The neighbor who I had mentioned originally, who started us down this road, came in with an offer of $1.17 million. And then there's a nonprofit organization in the Twin Cities that was very interested, that Jack had made a connection with, and they were interested in buying the property for $1.8 million. Now, realizing that if that had happened, we as a council understood that if this option was the one that we ultimately chose, some of that would obviously have to go back to Pathways to help them then move on in their ministry with whatever that might be away from Emmaus, because then Emmaus would no longer be operating as a Bible camp. After some discussion, our Trinity Executive Committee decided to pursue offer number 2, the sale to the neighbor, with the ultimate donation of the land of the camp land back to Pathways. Well, there was concern on Pathways' part that what if after 5 years the neighbor decides, or maybe the other family members from the neighbor's family decide, no, we don't want to give this land back to Pathways. So they wanted some kind of assurance this was going to happen, and the neighbor understood this, and he reached out to me and to Pathways and said his idea was that they would establish an LLC between Pathways and his family that would have joint ownership of parcel number 1 for these 5 years. And then after 5 years, then Pathways would take that over. But Pathways would have this limited ownership of it for those 5 years. But the cost of Pathways to enter into that agreement was going to be $350,000. Okay. So, and I'm certainly leaving out much of the discussions that went on between Pathways and ourselves. I should acknowledge at this point, those of us who were most intimately involved in these discussions, on the Trinity side, it was myself, or Vice President Tara Iverson, and then Pastor Simon. On the Pathways side, it was Pastor Chris Leach, their Pathways board chair, along with Chris Andreasen, who's here today, the Pathways Executive Director. Chris is also a member of Trinity. Ira Bailey, who is here today as well. Ira is a member of Trinity, but our elected representative to the Pathways Board. And then also Mark Hensrud. Mark, I just want to give a wave to people. Mark is another board member for Pathways who lives in this region. So it was really the two groups of us who got together many, many times, both in person and virtually, to give offers back and forth, give counteroffers, and ultimately after, and I should say, initially, there was a lot of just trust building. I think when I made that initial call to Pastor Chris Leach, he didn't know me, I didn't know him, so it took several weeks and several times of getting together to realize that, yes, we were looking out for our own best interest, but at the same time, we also understood the best interest of where the other group was coming from, and we wanted to make sure that their interests were adhered to as well. So we really developed this trust with each other that we were in this mutually, and this was still, even though we've had 90 years of a partnership between Trinity and Pathways, we were continuing that partnership, but now in a new way, and want to see that partnership continue. So again, I'm leaving out a lot of those back and forth discussions, but there were several. So ultimately then, the two groups decided on these 3 options. And here they were. So number 1, Trinity sells parcels 1 to 3 to Pathways for $50,000, and Pathways makes a $500,000 pledge over 5 years to the Trinity Capital Campaign. So realize that this was just for parcels 1 through 3. This would have left parcel 4 with us, which we intended to sell on the open market, most likely to the neighbor who had expressed interest in that. And we were confident that we could get $150,000 to $200,000 for that property should we decide to sell it. The next option, though, was that Pathways buys everything, not for $50,000, but for $200,000. And still makes a $500,000 pledge to Trinity's capital campaign. So realize what's happening here now is Pathways is taking that $150,000 that we most likely would have sold it for, and giving and essentially buying parcel 4 from us for $150,000 at this point. And then option number 3, I want to make sure everybody understands this. Trinity sells parcels 1 to 4 to the neighboring group for the $1.7 million that was offered, but then we would give $350,000 back to Pathways to enter into that LLC with the neighbors for joint ownership of parcel number 1. So what I want people to understand here is that in this option, there was no financial commitment from Pathways. Pathways would have to pay zero for this. But of course, it limited their options. They didn't have ownership of parcels 2, 3, and 4, which is ultimately what they decided to do. So we presented all these offers, and they were okay with the 3 of them, and then their idea then was that they would take this back to their board for approval. And you can see here that then on August 31st, the Pathways board voted 14-2 to accept option number 2, really the most expensive option for them. And then at our next council meeting, we voted 8-1 to also accept option number 2. So this is the offer that Pathways gave to us at that time, that their board voted 14-2 to accept. So we'll read this together. Trinity sells parcels 1-4 to Pathways for $200,000, and Pathways makes a $500,000 pledge to Trinity's capital campaign to be fulfilled by December 31st, 2026, which we anticipate to be 5 years from the point of sale. As part of our pledge, Pathways will sign a covenant of commitment that states, we commit to fulfilling a $500,000 pledge to support Trinity's ministry through its capital campaign to be completed within 5 years of the point of sale. If Pathways does not fulfill this pledge, we commit in good faith to deeding the Bible camp back to Trinity. Pathways does retain full rights over the decisions of Camp Emmaus' future from the point of sale. And I want to read to you, this all came in an email from Pastor Chris, and I want to read to you what else he wrote to me to give some context for their decision. So, we arrived at a place where we were generally comfortable with both options 1 and 2. Interestingly enough, we were unanimously concerned about option 3 and didn't feel like that direction served the ministry God is calling both our organizations to do. The difference between 1 and 2 to us was opportunity versus risk. 1 was safer, less debt, but losing the 160 acres limited future options. We also know that all of this land was purchased, given with the dream of it being part of a Bible camp. We wanted to honor that dream, and while we know realistically that we may need to just sell the 160 to cover the purchase debt load, we went with option 2 and will take the financial risk as we discern its future and seek to raise those funds elsewhere. And he goes on to say, finally, we are excited that this whole conversation has led us to this moment, and we are excited to take the reins of our future in continued partnership with Trinity. We are so thankful for your support of Pathways Ministry and the faithful help throughout the years. Our pledge commitment to you is not just about a purchase for us, but to also honor our history together and support your mission, being a beacon of light in Moorhead and beyond. Thank you for this partnership, and we are excited to see where God continues to lead us together. At last week's informational meeting, there was a good point that was brought up, that there was a loophole that was left. What if Pathways would choose to sell Emmaus, and then after 5 years, they don't fulfill their campaign pledge, and then there's no Emmaus to deed back to Trinity. So we had a discussion about that, and the Pathways board members were involved as well. And I just want to show, this is the actual motion that we'll be bringing, not at this point, but I want you to see that language was taken care of. So everything up here reads essentially the same, and I just italicized the last sentence that we added. Should Pathways decide to sell the Emmaus property before the pledge is fulfilled, Pathways will use proceeds of the sale to complete its pledge to Trinity. So this is not yet written into legal language. That will be the next step for us. But the legal language will certainly follow the spirit of what we're voting on today. Let me just, in summary now, bring together what I think are the benefits for everyone involved here. Benefits for Trinity. Immediate sale releases Trinity from any concerns regarding liability at Camp Emmaus. We also net $700,000 to our capital campaign. Benefits for Pathways. Pathways is able to determine its own future with control of all properties, and its fundraising is no longer hindered by any questions of who owns the property. And then, of course, the benefit for all, Camp Emmaus continues to be used for the purpose for which it was originally purchased, and that is, of course, spreading the gospel to young people. So at this point, I would like to call up Ira Bailey, our elected Trinity representative to the Emmaus Board, and also Chris Andreasen, the Executive Director of Pathways, to say a few things.
Good morning. When I took this position as part of the Pathways Board, I never imagined that this was going to be what would be the direction that we would be taking. But everything has really come together kind of in a perfect place for this change of direct ownership of Camp Emmaus. For us and for the Pathways Corporation, whose ministry is also part of the Northwest Minnesota Synod of the ELCA. And it's important for me to, as I thought about this, that it's a little bit like the transfer of ownership of a business or a farm from the parent to the child. Trinity was an integral part in 1969 of forming the Pathways Corporation. And as I think about all of this, it's really lots of ministries have come to put each of us into this position of being Christians and Lutherans and a part of this. And Camp Emmaus is a ministry. When we talked about it last summer at our board meetings, we kept thinking about it as a lot of people think about, from Trinity especially, think about this as being an asset, and I think that it's a ministry that we're doing here. And as good stewards of the ministry, it's time for us to transfer that ministry into the hands of Pathways so that we can all work together to build that ministry. It's, as we've said before, Mark said, it's hard to invest in something that somebody else owns and somebody else sees as their asset. And so it's really, this is really an exciting time for us as the Pathways Board to look at this and have this be something that all of the churches, I think there are somewhere around 170 churches, and that are the owners and the investors and are represented by Pathways to do all of this. And the key to this is that the Pathways Board really believes strongly that this is a manageable contribution to Trinity that allows Pathways as a larger group of churches to have everyone contribute to the development of the camp, and we're excited about this as an opportunity. And the properties that we own here or the sanctuary or other places, they're only assets when their ministry is complete. Until then, it doesn't matter what the value of the land or the buildings are. Their value is the roof over this place and the space that we use for our ministry.
Thank you, Ira. Well, good morning, everyone. On behalf of Pathways, I want to express our sincere gratitude and appreciation to you here at Trinity. Mark mentioned all the different ways that you have long supported Pathways through the budget, through the foundation, through sending campers, their office space, and not to mention your thoughts and your prayers. So thank you so much. In addition to some of the numbers that Mark shared, Pathways has made significant investment into the property. He mentioned the building of the lodge for $250,000. In the 90s, renovating the retreat rooms in the basement. That was another significant investment. Since then, we've done some other things. We just built a brand new maintenance garage at camp that really changed the footprint of how we operate at camp. We've completely renovated our staff building, as well as the girls' bathhouse. And we have plans for further improvements out there to the chapel and the boys' bathhouse. But significant investment is still required out at Camp Emmaus. I want to say thank you to the negotiating teams, both from Pathways and on the Trinity Council. It has been quite the journey over the last year and a half, through countless meetings and discussions to get to the point where we are today. So thank you so much. We really feel that the ownership and commitment at Camp Emmaus by Pathways will sustain the ministry site at Camp Emmaus going forward. It is my hope and my goal that my daughter in the back, who's 1 year old, can have an experience at Camp Emmaus, can be impacted by God's beautiful creation at that ministry site. That's what we really want. And it comes down to the vision of the Reverend Dr. Frederick Schutz of taking a step out in faith to purchase that site for ministry, and the vision of Pastor Bruce Herman, who started Pathways, to continue to impact the faith of youth and adults through that beautiful creation and through sharing the love of Jesus Christ at Camp Emmaus. So we really hope that that can continue. Thank you.
So now we'll move into motions along with the discussions of the motions. So first, we'll be talking about the property to the south, Gate City property. Do I have a motion to sell 707 3rd Avenue South property to Gate City Bank for $100,000? Okay, Gary Nolte. Oh, I see Neil's already standing up. Are you going to second?
Yes, I second.
All right, Neil Iverson with the second. Is there any discussion? Discussion? All right, I will ask the tellers then to, have the ballots been passed out? We have not passed out the ballots. Okay, so pass out the ballots and then collect the ballots. All confirmed members of Trinity are allowed to vote? What? Oh, and you're just writing yes or no. Yes is in approval of the motion, no is not approving the motion. Oh, now as this is finishing up, let's move on to motion number 2. Is there anybody who would like to make this motion? Ira Bailey.
Motion number 2, as it's read on the board.
So we've got a motion made by Ira Bailey. I suppose I should read the whole thing first. To sell Camp Emmaus property parcels 1 to 4 to Pathways Bible Camp for $200,000 with a covenant of commitment that states we commit to fulfilling a $500,000 pledge to support Trinity's ministry through its capital campaign to be completed within 5 years of the point of sale. If Pathways does not fulfill this pledge, we commit in good faith to deeding the Bible camp back to Trinity. Pathways does retain full rights over the decisions of Camp Emmaus' future from the point of sale. Should Pathways decide to sell the Emmaus property before the pledge is fulfilled, Pathways will use proceeds of the sale to complete its pledge to Trinity. So we have a motion. Do we have a second? Chad Hansen, I see you're pointing to Michael Colleton. So technically, that'll be Michael Colleton. Thank you, Michael. Okay, we have a motion, we have a second, so now let's open up for discussion.
A simple question for you. Are you keeping the mineral and water rights, or are you selling that with the land? There's a lot of gravel and money to be made on that, up in that area.
That is something that we've never discussed. I don't know where that stands right at this point. If we own that,
Hi, this is Bob Dale. Just a couple of comments, I think. I am in favor of kind of doing something with the property. I'm not totally convinced on the value of what we're giving versus, what the true value of that is. So I'm concerned with that. And the other issue is, upon sale, I don't see any language in there that if Pathways were to sell that and use it for other camps, for the 1.8 million, let's say, is there any language in that contract that would say that within a period of years or so that really it would come back to Trinity, or could they just take all that proceeds and use it for something else?
yeah. Yeah, thanks for that, Bob. And I know other people have thought the same thing. Certainly there is an amount of faith that we're both putting in each other in this agreement that Pathways will continue to use this property to, again, use it as a Bible camp and continue to spread the gospel of Jesus through young people. And we have no reason to think they won't do that. So there is particularly that amount of faith that we are stepping out. And we do think that at least we will get the pledge of the $500,000 based on the language that we have here, in addition to the $200,000 sale. And again, I've told this to many of you, and we still are a church, right? And we're not fully a business. We are fully a church. So there's certainly a business aspect to this, but we do it, I think, first and foremost as a church. So when we started these discussions, I know we had people in this church who say we should just give this to them free of charge. And then there are people who say we need to get as much money for this property as we possibly can. So those are really the two extremes that we're dealing with, and we knew that going into this. So what our hope was to find that middle ground that maybe no one would have chosen from the start, but everyone can say, I see why we're doing this, and I find this acceptable. So that's my hope and where we've come to. Roger. Roger's saying we're voting on this without any formal purchase agreement, and that is correct. We will now, after this, if this passes, we will now move into more legal language, and we've been in communication with Pathways about this, and we understand that legal language will still then hold to the spirit of what we have agreed upon. Oh, yes, Shar.
Hi, Shar Tollickson. My history with Pathways was a little bit rocky, and Pathways had some very difficult years. And I just want to say that with Chris Andreasen as the executive director, I have really seen a turnaround with Pathways, and I really trust that they will keep it a Bible camp and do it right. I think we have finally found the executive director that we needed at camp, at Pathways. Thank you.
Thank you, Shar. Chad.
I don't want to be like a negative Nelly. I support the camp, and we've talked a little bit about what it's worth. We seem to be focusing on the value of the property. I also would like to point out for our church, it's a liability exposure as well, right? So, if you look, just do a quick search online of like legal settlements of kids who've been injured at camps. Kid falls into a fire pit, $500,000. Tree falls on kid, $2.5 million. So this does pose a legal liability to Trinity Lutheran Church and the Trinity Lutheran Church Foundation as well. So that's something to think about. We love to have this asset, but is a Bible camp the right asset for this church to own right now? I would like to personally see it be put in a situation where it has a chance of succeeding, right? Where, but it also would be nice to get it out of our liability exposure as a church as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. And certainly I had that in the summary, that liability was a concern, and that came up a lot in our discussions, and I think that was where some of the dissatisfaction in the current agreement would come from, understanding that the camp is getting older, and with Pathways not having ownership of the camp, their fundraising was somewhat hamstrung by its relationship to Trinity. So now Pathways can move forward with full ownership and make those improvements that it knows it needs to make. David.
David Hunstead, Trinity member. I've been worried about this day for 15 years, or 30 years, 35 years, 40 years, something like that. I was the director at Camp Emmaus in the 80s, 82 to 88, when the 25-year lease, when we celebrated our 50th, the Camp Emmaus celebrated its 50th anniversary. And all of the conversations and all the celebration were the vision of Fred Schutz to start a Bible camp for the young people of northwestern Minnesota. At the time the 25-year lease was arranged, there was discussion, there was a question about Pathways viability and whether or not we could trust Pathways. There was conversation about the emotional attachment to the land, that people from Trinity went out and helped with the construction of the cabins and so forth. And the 25-year lease was developed so that there would be time to really evaluate and to kind of let some of that emotional attachment go away and make the best decision for Bible camping, for the young people, for the property that Fred Schutz purchased with his own life insurance policy. He didn't use Trinity funds, by the way. I'm kind of embarrassed that we're here today talking about it as an asset, honestly. I don't think that Camp Emmaus is an asset for Trinity. I think it's a ministry for northwestern Minnesota, for the young people that use that camp. I don't think that in 1988, when Kathy and I moved here and Trinity was raising money for this beautiful facility here and for the offices over there, Trinity gave 10% above and beyond what they raised and needed to build this building to other ministries. This time we're asking Pathways to give 10% of our total, not even our total, but we're asking Pathways to fund 10% of this building that we're going to use. I don't think any of us have contributed to the parking lot at Cormorant Lutheran. I don't think any of us have ever been to Calvary Lutheran in Park Rapids, or any of us have been even over to Good Shepherd and said, hey, how can we help you raise the money for your building? And we're asking Pathways to do that for us. And that embarrasses me. I just think that we have an obligation to outdoor ministry. We've put handcuffs on Trinity, or on Pathways long enough. Because they can't raise the money. How are they're going to have to raise $500,000 so that we can have a better entrance and so that we can have couches and chairs and a coffee shop? Camp Emmaus is not our asset. Camp Emmaus belongs to the campers of northwestern Minnesota Synod. And for us to stand here today and think, well, then Pathways will own it and we won't have any liability. I think we have to really consider, are we asking the campers from northwestern Minnesota Synod to fund our parking lot? Are we going to continue the vision that's been in place for 88 years, that we want accessible, affordable camping for our young people? And I think the thought of us benefiting $700,000 or $1.5 million or $50,000 is wrong. You listed the payments over the years, the $15,000, the $11,000, the $12,000 that every congregation in the Pathways constituency gives money out of their operating fund to operate. So that's not a feather in our cap. That's just an obligation. That's just what we do. And so when I started, I didn't know if I was going to be in favor or against this motion, because I think Pathways needs to own that camp. Pathways can't. There's no way that Pathways is going to be able to sustain ministry when we view it as an asset. How are the members of these congregations along Highway 10 and Crookston, how are they supposed to look at that camp? And why would they give money to build our asset so that 10 years from now or 15 years from now there'll be new cabins and new chapel, and there'll be new shower rooms, and it'll be worth $4 million. Why would they do that? So I guess maybe I'm supposed to say beforehand, I didn't know, but now I know. I'm voting against this.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Anyone else? Are you ready to vote? All right, then let's make sure that we've received all of the motion 1 votes first, and then tellers, would you please hand out the ballots for motion number 2? So as the ballots are being picked up, do I have a motion for adjournment? Ted? Is there a second? Second from Jerry. That's it. All right. All those in favor of adjourning, please say aye. Pastor Matt, would you mind closing in prayer for us?
The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Lord God, your Spirit has moved among us. We ask that you continue to be with us, to guide us, again as we conclude this season of Lent and head to observe the events of this Holy Week. Keep us close to your Son, our Savior Jesus Christ. Remind us of the promise that comes through his cross, the promise of hope, the promise of a future of new life, the promise of mercy and forgiveness. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you for being here, everybody. I will communicate the results of the votes at the end of the second service.
Myself, we have the results of the earlier vote.
The results of the 2 motions that were presented at the Congregational Meeting. Motion number 1, to sell 707 3rd Avenue South. Yes, 107, no, 1. Motion number 2, to sell Camp Emmaus. Yes, 102, no, 11. So thank you for everybody.